Now let's see how we multiply fractions. And as you'll see, multiplication is actually a little bit easier than addition or subtraction. That's why we're going to see them first. So how do we multiply fractions? Well, we simply multiply the numerators together to get the new numerator, and we multiply the denominators together to get a new denominator. Okay, so let's see an example. So in this case, we're going to be multiplying 2/3 by 4/5. Okay, first thing we do is we identify the numerators. So remember, the numerators are the two numbers at the top. And if we multiply them in this case, we do 2 times 4 and we get 8. Okay, now we identify the denominators, which are the numbers at the bottom. So we're going to do 3 times 5, and that's going to give us 15. Okay, now if we put all that together, we're going to end up with 2 times 4 over 3 times 5, which is 8 over 15. Okay, now let's take a step back here, because in school we tend to see fractions from a very mathematical calculus point of view, right? But in the GMAT and in real life, right, and in business, you want to, as much as possible, keep an eye on like what these numbers mean and do they make sense. Okay, now let's go back to the example of eating cake. Well, in this case, again, we're quite greedy, so we've taken 2/3 of the cake. Okay, but a friend has arrived and has made us feel a little bit guilty, so we decide to give them a little bit of our cake. Okay, but we're going to still keep, remember we are greedy, right? We're going to keep 4/5 of the 2/3 that we took. Okay, and actually that's what we're doing here as an operation. When we multiply 2/3 by 4/5, that's what we're calculating. Okay, now 4/5 is most of something, right? Because the 4 is very close to the 5, the total amount. Okay, so when we take 4/5 of something, we expect to get most of it. All right, 2/3 is a bit more than half a cake, right? So when we take 4/5 of 2/3, we would expect something to be around 1/2 of the cake as a result. Okay, and if we look at our result, 8 over 15, is 8 roughly half of 15? Yes, it is. Okay, half of 15 would be 7.5, and we're getting a little bit more than that, 8, right? But it feels generally right. Now, in the GMAT, I would encourage you to do this kind of thing very often. Okay, why? Because it's important for spotting mistakes, right? And the other thing is that it allows you to choose the right path in terms of which method to approach. Okay, we'll see plenty of examples of how to put that in practice in the future. Right, let's see now another example and make this a little bit more complicated. Okay, so let's skip this one and move on to this one. Okay, so in this case, we're doing 3/4 times 8/9. Okay, so the normal way to do this would be to multiply the numerators together and the denominators together. So 3 times 8 equals 24, and 4 times 9 equals 36. Okay, and at this stage, well, your teacher in school would probably tell you, well, now turn this into its simplest form. Okay, so another way of saying that is simplify the fraction. Okay, and in that case, well, the teacher would probably get you to identify that 24 is 3 times 4 times 2. Okay, you can do that in steps. So you can first say that 24 is 12 times 2 and then split the 12 into 3 times 4. Okay, and then 36, well, a similar approach would get you to 4 times 3 times 3. Okay, and if we look at the fraction now, we have a 3 and a 4 in the numerator, and we have a 4 and a 3 in the denominator. Okay, So here actually in this number, we're multiplying by 3 and by 4, and then we're dividing by 3 and 4. Okay, but both of those operations actually cancel out. Okay, so we can simplify this fraction and we would be left with just the 2 and the 3, which is 2/3. Okay, so here you would get full marks at school, right? But in the GMAT, it's actually not the best approach, right? Why? Because the GMAT is a time pressured exam, right? And you don't have the time to do some work in one direction to then undo it in another direction, okay? And that's essentially what we're doing here, because by making the multiplication of 3 times 8, 24, and then splitting it again, right, and doing the same for the 36, we're doing work and then we're undoing the work. Okay, so it's much more efficient to actually, starting from our initial multiplication, 3 over 4 times 8 over 9, well, we can start by combining everything into one fraction, right? But rather than jumping into multiplying the numerators, we're actually going to split the 8 into 4 times 2, and we're going to split the 9 into 3 times 3. Okay, that way we can identify these common factors and simplify the fraction before actually doing any multiplication. And if you look at this, so we get to the same result of 2/3, but we don't do any multiplication. The only thing we're actually doing is we're splitting the 8 into 4 times 2, and we're splitting the 9 into 3 times 3, and all the rest is just crossing things out. Okay, that in a nutshell is how you multiply fractions in the GMAT, and it's extremely important because fractions come up all the time in the GMAT, because whenever you do any calculation, effectively when you're multiplying and dividing things, that in a sense is a fraction, right? So we'll come back to this when we see the simplification chapter in this lesson. Okay, I think it's part 5, if I remember correctly. We'll come back to that, but it's a very important part of the GMAT.